want to welcome you to today's program, and for those of you who are following the series, I'm now in Acts chapter 8, and I'm reading from the authorized version, which I must admit is my favorite, but I have to admit that a lot of it is in what we call Old English, but I understand Old English. I learnt it. Anyway, so in the last chapter, we ended with basically the death of Stephen and commenting on the fact that he was the first Christian martyr and certainly not the last. And so we come into chapter 8 because the last verse of chapter 7 is Stephen kneeled down, cried with a loud voice, "Lord, lay not this sin to their charge." And when he had said this, he fell asleep. And you know, only commenting to the staff that when I was a teenager, one book that I read was, if you know it, it's a famous book, Fox's Book of Martyrs. And I used to ask my father how these men who were brutally killed could face death. And my father said, helpfully to me, he said, "I don't think at the end they do feel it. I think that the Lord does take away some of the pain." And I think this was the case with Stephen. He wasn't crying out and being murdered, or he was being murdered, but he wasn't crying out in pain. He was saying that he was calling upon God and saying, "Lord Jesus, receive my spirit." And then he fell asleep. And to me, that's beautiful. Anyway, we come on to chapter 8. And of course, the chapter 8 opens up with the critical one. This is one of the most critical passages in the Acts, because it says Saul, and remember at this time he had not changed his name. He was Saul. He was consenting to the death of Stephen. In actual fact, he was apparently so close that he was holding the clothes of the men who were stoning Stephen. And it says in that first verse, at that time there was a great persecution against the church, which was at Jerusalem. Now, I'm finding this very, very significant. There was persecution against the church. The church at that time was in Jerusalem. And then in the next part of the same verse, it says, as a result, they were scattered abroad throughout the regions of Judea and Samaria, except the apostles. So here we see, and I've only in preparing for this message do I see the significance, because in one sense, you think that by this time the apostles are carrying the mission to the mission fields. But at this point, no. The apostles were still in Jerusalem. It was these new converts that were spread abroad, and quite widely, because all the regions of Judea and Samaria. So you can see that what has happened here is that the persecution has forced the new converts to leave Jerusalem and take the message. And you know, for me, it's only a matter of days ago. I'm speaking on a Wednesday, and on the weekend, last weekend, Saturday and Sunday, I was with the Ukrainian refugees in Poland. Both days I had different congregations, but there was about 1,000 each time that came. And the interesting thing is that it's not just that they were refugees from the war, but the fact that the leaders and the pastor said to me, "David, we are here to evangelize Europe." And they've already got the message that being scattered doesn't mean just simply that you're running away. It's God spreading the message. And it's not only there, but I've heard this testimony because I met one of the men who was with me more than 30 years ago in Belarus and in Gomel. We evangelized there, and I never thought that it was so big, because in Brest we had thousands filling the football stadium, but we'd gone to Gomel. And I didn't know until this man told me two things. One, the incredible healing miracles that happened. You know, I see some of them and record them. I don't see the full impact. And this is 35 years later, and they're saying, oh, David, did you know about that crippled man carried him with his crutches? And God instantly healed him. He threw away his crutches and walked 20 kilometers home. That for a cripple. And not only that, he said, David, as a result of that one crusade, we opened 50 churches. 50 churches. Oh, I thank God for those days. And in a way, I'm so glad I didn't know all the news. It's just wonderful after all these years to know. Anyway, so what we're looking at, and we're still on chapter 8 of the Acts and the verse, they were, the new converts were scattered abroad, but not the apostles. And in verse 2, we come down to the very practical issue, because devout men, not the apostles, devout men carried Stephen for his burial and wept over him. But in verse 3, Saul made havoc. I like that word in the English. That's why I like this version. He made havoc of the church. That to make havoc is you cause enormous problems. I can't think of a word more descriptive in the English. You make havoc. Yeah, that meant there was great trouble. Havoc of the church, entering into every house and taking men and women and committing them to prison. So this was going on at that moment. It's going on in Jerusalem. But in verse 4, the result was all this meant that they were scattered abroad and went everywhere preaching. I just love this. Exactly what I was saying. They went everywhere preaching the word. And, you know, I suppose this is the origin, really, of the explosion of the mission following Pentecost. But this is such a challenge to all of us, not to look on even running away from war or fleeing because of persecution and so on, but it should give us simply an opportunity to spread the gospel, and they did.